The theme of this conference, as you know, is growing threats for democracy around the world. Growing threats for democracy around the world. And my talk is about the role of the rule of law in protecting democracy. The rule of law, what is that? The rule of law is the fact that a state has functioning laws, a constitution, other functioning laws, functioning courts, and strong authorities like the police, for example, prosecutors. That's the rule of law. How important is it for preserving democracy that a country has this, a well-functioning rule of law? And what is the role of the rule of law? Well, the role of the rule of law in protecting democracy certainly depends a lot on what kind of a threat it is to democracy that we're talking about. So what different kinds of threats could there be to democracy? I'm going to give you 6 different kinds of threats. And I'm going to say also now that at the end I'm coming back a little bit to what Miroslava Chomik said in the speech before me. I thought that was very impressive, and I thought she said some things that go well along with my speech, but I'm not telling you what it's going to be that I'm going to say. But it doesn't have to do with the law. The different kinds of threats in the world to democracy. Well, there is one which means that criminal gangs are taking over. Criminals are taking over the country, and the government doesn't really have anything to do with power anymore. Democracy does not work. The criminal gangs will rule, like it is in Haiti today, like it is partly in Mexico, where the criminal gangs have a lot of power, where it was at least in Colombia some years ago. I call that the criminal threat or the mafia threat. It's basically mostly like mafia people taking power. That's certainly an important threat to democracy in some countries. Then there is the threat that has challenged democracy in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, and in Egypt, for example. What is the common denominator for those? It is that somebody is taking over by military force, basically. It's not the same kind of action that happened in Myanmar and Afghanistan, of course, but it's something that I would call the coup threat, the coup, C-O-U-P, the coup threat. Then there is the threat to democracy, which we are experiencing today in, for example, Somalia and Libya, and to some extent in Mali. What is that? It's the states dissolving. The clans take over, or other groups take over. It's not criminal gangs, but it's others than the government. Libya is not being ruled by its central government today. I call that the dissolution threat. They dissolve, the dissolution threat. Then there is the threat that is now facing Ukraine. We have been talking about Ukraine all this conference. And it's obvious that the attack on Ukraine today by Russia is threatening the Ukraine democracy. We have sort of the same kind of threat towards Taiwan, although it hasn't happened yet. We have it to some extent towards Kosovo. Some people would not agree with that, but it's at least You know what I mean. That's the external threat. The threat coming from outside. The external threat. That's number 4. Then there is the threat to democracy that is now existing in countries like Iran, to some extent in Venezuela, in Russia, in Eritrea, to some extent in Turkey. I'm talking about the oppression threat, the limits to freedom. You put people behind bars who oppose the government, dictatorship. I call that the oppression threat. And then there is the threat that appeared in the US a few years ago, when Donald Trump tried to stay in power by cheating the system. And I don't know how far Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil came with doing the same, but there was at least signs that some things of that kind happened there. I call that the cheating threat. Donald Trump tried to cheat himself back into power. So there's the mafia threat, the coup threat, the dissolution threat, the external threat, the oppression threat, and the cheating threat. I want to mention a 7th threat today that I'm not going to continue talking about, but it's been very topical these last months in Sweden, which is my country. This is our flag. And that is not quite a threat to democracy, but more a threat to freedom and stability. I would call it the hate speech threat. I think you know what I'm talking about. In Sweden, we have let some people who are very, very critical, to say it lightly, against Islam and the Muslim people and the Muslim world. We have let them demonstrate by burning the Quran, the Holy Scripture of Islam. And there has been, of course, massive protests in the Muslim world against these burnings of the Quran. And there is a big discussion in our country now and in many parts of the world whether it is reasonable to allow this to happen. I have taken part in that discussion myself, and I have been taking part in it together with some people here in the room. And the discussion continues. And it may be that in Sweden we will either change the law or accept the fact that it is maybe not allowed today even. It may be punishable to burn the Quran in Sweden today. There's a discussion going on about that. This is not, I call this the hate speech threat, but I mentioned it mostly because I wanted to mention it because it's been so topical. I'm not talking about that anymore in my speech now. But so what can the rule of law do to protect democracy when it comes to these 6 threats that I've been mentioning? What can the rule of law do? And how does it have to do with conscience that we heard about before? I'll be back to that at the end. The mafia threat. Can the rule of law do anything to protect democracy in countries against those things that have happened in Haiti and in Mexico? Yes, of course. If we have strong, functioning laws, functioning courts, and functioning police, we can protect ourselves against things happening like those that have in Haiti and in Mexico, for example. So the rule of law, if it is strong in a country, can very well protect against what I have called the criminality threat or the mafia threat. The coup threat, that which has happened in Myanmar and Afghanistan and Egypt, can the rule of law do anything to protect against that? Can the rule of law stop the military from taking power in Myanmar, for example? I would say basically not. Basically not a lot. The coup threat is using weapons, and the rule of law can't do much to protect the state from those who want to take over power using weapons. The dissolution threat, that which has happened in Libya and in Mali and in Somalia, can the rule of law protect from that? Yes, it is difficult, but if you have a strong constitution and if you have courts and police and other authorities that will have the backup by functioning laws, you can protect your country from getting into a situation like that. So that there is a role for the rule of law there. How about the external threats? Russia getting on Ukraine like it has, possibly China moving on to Taiwan, and others. Can the rule of law do anything about that? Not a lot. The rule of law in Ukraine could not protect Ukraine from being attacked by Russia. I was going to say, what could the rule of law in Russia have done about it? But let's not get into that. The oppression threat. I've talked about Iran, Russia, to some extent, Turkey, Venezuela, the way it was a few years ago. Yes, the oppression threat can very well be met. Democracy can be protected by rule of law when it comes to oppression. If you just have a strong constitution giving democracy a very strong hand and protecting freedom, like freedom of expression, for example, and the dictator can't come in and change the constitution quickly, then you have a very strong protection against the oppression threat, in principle. Cheating, what Donald Trump did or tried to do in the US. He tried to cheat himself back into power. Well, it was basically the American rule of law that protected the country from him coming back through cheating, I would say. The rule of law plays a great role in protecting democracy against those kinds of cheatings. So sometimes the rule of law plays a role, sometimes not. But then there is the question of the international rule of law. You know, I have been talking about the nations and the states and what they can be doing with their rule of law in protecting democracy. But what about the international rule of law? We have the United Nations and we have other organizations like the Council of Europe that have conventions which will, in different respects, try to protect democracy and protect freedom. So what about I'll do this really quickly, go through the 6 again. What about the mafia threat? The threat that things happen like they've done in Mexico and Haiti. Could the international rule of law, the international community, do anything about that? Stop it from happening? Well, yes. Today, if Haiti would ask the international community for help, and there would be an international convention to let the international community step in, that could very well happen. I'm not aware that there is such a convention today. I am aware that maybe the US would step in if there will be an ask for help. But as far as I think, there have been desires for help from the Haiti government, and nothing has really happened. I may not be well updated here, but that's as far as I know, that they haven't gotten any help there. The gangs are still ruling. What about the coup threat, like that happened in Myanmar or Afghanistan? Could the international rule of law do anything to protect the countries from that? No, not really. Maybe in the long term, if we would have a convention that would say that if the military steps in to take over a country, there will be an international force that will step in and take over and protect democracy. But we don't have anything at all like that today. We may wish that we had, but it's far-fetched. It's way in the future. The dissolution threat, Libya, could the international rule of law have protected that from happening? Yes, if the Libyan government had asked for the international community to step in, it would have been possible. And it's possible that we would have a convention. We don't have it, but it's possible that if the UN put its efforts into it, we would have a convention that would stop the dissolution that has happened in, for example, Somalia and Libya from happening in the future. Could very well happen. The external threats. Could the international rule of law stop Russia from getting into Ukraine? No, I don't see how that could happen. That's not a matter of the rule of law at all. Oppression then. Iran, Afghanistan, Russia, Eritrea. Could the international rule of law do anything about that? Not much, I think. It's an internal thing to have the rule of law in place to prevent that from happening. And finally, the cheating in the US. Could the international rule of law do anything against that? No, that's also a national affair, a domestic affair, to stop that from happening. You need a strong national constitution. So, I am ending in 3 minutes. What should be done? What should be done? And this is where I come back to Miroslava Chomik and to what she said. She said, we need to return to preserving our morality. And she said, do not lose the common compass that we all have, the conscience. Morality and conscience. What does that have to do with law? It has everything to do with law, because the lawmaker bases its work, its actions on what is right. And if the international community feels that it's its responsibility to act to preserve democracy in states like Libya, Haiti, for example, then it could. It's a matter of taking responsibility if there is one. So that is a very core question. Is there an international community responsibility for people in states like Libya and Haiti, or is there not an international community responsibility? Very important question. I think there is. And I think one should work diligently in the United Nations to set things, I wouldn't say straight, but make things better at least. The UN is not doing enough. I think that the United Nations should work more diligently to strengthen the rule of law in those countries which need it, at least those which ask for it. There is a need for strengthening the rule of law in many countries, and there should be a possible process to get the help from the international community to do this. And finally, I also think that the international rule of law should be strengthened by conventions that will help to protect democracy against things happening like, for example, in Myanmar and Haiti and Somalia, etc. Strengthen the international rule of law, help countries to strengthen the domestic rule of law. We need to return to preserving our morality, conscience. Thank you.
Thank you for this very incisive and fascinating speech. We have time for maybe one question. Okay, I'm sorry, her hand went up first.
I'm sorry. Thank you. It's a very inspiring speech and very insightful for me personally. I, ever since the start of the war, and any war that, for that matter, that I've been learning or hearing about, I was always questioning this very topic, the international rule of law. And where do we stand with that now? I'm glad you're raising the conversation, but I'm just curious, how close are we to actually strengthening that? Are there talks about this? Or what is being done?
I think I could say that there is nothing being done to prevent that from happening, which has happened in Ukraine. The only thing we are doing, and that is important enough, is to follow up on the horrific war crimes that are committed in Ukraine. And I heard the other day that there are about 80,000 war crimes that have been proven, and that depends, of course, on how you count and what you and what you're interested in. But it's obvious that there have been horrific war crimes, and the possibility to follow up, to get Putin before the stands, so to speak, is something which will probably not happen, but at least the risk of that happening for somebody like him and others in his group should be raised. And I think there is a work going on about that, so that could happen. But to prevent a state like Russia from doing what it has done, there is nothing in international law being done about it, as far as I know.
Yeah, I'm sorry, that's all the time we have. But please address your questions to the Chancellor afterwards. Thank you so much for this incredible speech. It was very interesting.